Hi guys, welcome back to Big Strong Book. I'm Reed, and today we're going to be going over the Vor Game by Lois Mcmaster Bujold. So this book that I have here, it's one of the omnibus editions of the Vorkosigan Saga. This one is called Young Miles, and it has two novels and one novella in it. The two novels are The Warrior's Apprentice and the Vor Game, and then the novella within is The Mountains of Mourning. But I'll just be going over the Vor Game today. So this novel takes place and picks up about 3 years or so after the end of The Warrior's Apprentice. So Miles is just reaching the end of his, the imperial military schooling and training, and he gets an assignment to go off to a place called Kirill Island, or Camp Permafrost, I think is what the everybody in Barryar calls it, to do meteorology work. Not something that Miles, of course, wants to do. He has his sights set on being out there amid the stars, being out on. Everybody wants ship duty. And so that is what Miles' dream is. And so he gets that. His cousin, Ivan Vorpatrol, he gets Imperial security duty, but Miles goes off to Kirill Island. And to make a long story short of kind of the first part of the novel, there is somewhat of a revolt, a mutiny. Miles finds himself kind of caught in between. He takes a side and then kind of gets in trouble with the Imperial security, with, of course, Simon Ilian, who we know from previous novels, and off we go from there. This novel, I think, I found to be weaker than the other ones that I had read in the series. So just to preface, the other novels in the series that I had read before I read this, I had read Shards of Honor, Barryar, Warrior's Apprentice, the novella Mountains of Mourning, and I'd also read Ethan of Athos. This one I think was the weakest of those five, simply because this one felt too conveniently episodic. Now, from my understanding, the first 6 or 7 chapters of the Vor Game were published as a short story, or maybe it was a shorter novella. I can definitely see that. I can definitely see where there's the disconnect from the first fourth of the book, maybe, and then the last 75%. They feel like two completely different stories. I understand why what happens in the first fourth leads into the last 3/4, but to me it just seemed too convenient of a jump. It just seemed too much of a disconnect from going from this setting to this setting, and I would have much rather preferred if this book was just the last 3/4 rather than trying to tie in the beginning to the last chunk. That being said, a Vorkosigan novel that's a step below the others that I have read is still a damn good book. Just obviously the characterization of Miles. Miles is such a well-written protagonist. And I like that in this book, this book features more of Emperor Gregor, who is close in age to Miles, and he kind of made an appearance in The Warrior's Apprentice, much more so as a supporting character, but he's definitely hopped up as a main character in this one, and I liked to see that. I liked to see the explorations of Gregor's character being, I think he's supposed to be 25 years old, being an emperor ever since he was 5 years old, and seeing him grappling as he is a young adult, grappling with being an emperor of this society, of this planet, all that goes on with that, where at the same time he just wants to cut loose sometimes. He and Miles are kind of in that boat. Both of them understand that. But so it's kind of Gregor's his desire to kind of break free that also is another propellant for the plot. Again, this novel, it's similar in many respects to The Warrior's Apprentice in terms of how the plot kind of moves along. This one, besides just the fact that the first chunk is very different and it feels like two completely different stories going from the first bit to the last bit. In addition, in the last 75% of the book, I think it's a little too herky-jerky. The plot just goes from 0 to 100 and then back down to 0, and it's just kind of from here to here to here to here to here. And of course, you know that Miles is going to get out of the situations. It's not necessarily even a matter of how he will. You just know he will. But, I feel like this is it's a light 4 out of 5 for me. Certainly wasn't a bad read. It was still a fun read. I just think there was a little more rust along the tracks of this story and a little more just kind of jostling around through the narrative than there was. The Warrior's Apprentice felt very fluid. Certainly, Shards of Honor, I think you could argue it also has that kind of episodic feel. Barrayar, Ethan of Athos, I find to be the most fluid. Granted, Barrayar, reading that, even though chronologically it's the third in the overall story, the second that I read, Barrayar, I think, was the 7th or the 8th written. So Bujold had really honed her craft as a writer, as a storyteller. So maybe that being the most fluid of all of them just happens to be that I'm reading it out of order. So I'm going from, her early writings to when she's more seasoned, she has more books, has more stories under her belt. And the Vor Game was written, I think, shortly before Barrayar. I think this was published in 1990. Barrayar was maybe 91. And then I know the next one on my plate to read for this series, I'm not sure when I'll get to that, but soon, is Cetaganda. And Cetaganda, I think, was 95. So we're getting even further into it being a more developed pattern. Or maybe it's just simply the disconnect of reading a Miles book versus reading a Cordelia book. And that may just be that. So that may simply remain a quirk of the Miles books, is that they are kind of more herky-jerky. I know that as they go on, I've heard that novels like Memory and Komar and A Civil Campaign, that's, I think, from what I've heard, that's the peak of the Vorkosigan saga, kind of fitting that that's somewhat the middle of the story chronologically. So I'm looking forward to eventually getting to those later novels. But for the meantime, this is a fun story. For somebody new to the Vorkosigan saga, I do not recommend jumping into this. I think at the very least, starting from Shards of Honor, Barrayar, or even starting with The Warrior's Apprentice, if you're just more curious about Miles' story, that's another great one to jump into. This is, it's fun. I think it's a step down from The Warrior's Apprentice, certainly from The Mountains of Mourning. I think The Mountains of Mourning might be the best Vorkosigan story, period. Of the novels, Barrayar and Ethan of Athos, I think, are the strongest. But regardless, it's a fun read. I think of the things that happen in this, it's probably important to read this to understand things that happen in the future chronologically. I may be wrong on that. this could be a skippable book, but I don't think it is. Regardless, again, fun read. Would recommend it. So let me know what you guys think of the Vor Game, or just any of the Vorkosigan novels, any of the ones in this omnibus. And I will see you guys next time.